introducing our speaker, Marius. Before I do so, I did want to provide a little background. Back in late January 2019, Better Together presented their proposal to the public and simultaneously filed a petition to amend the state constitution for the merging of St. Louis City, County, and the 88 municipalities within St. Louis County. Among other parts of the proposal that attracted more attention, such as police and court consolidation, the proposal includes the combination of transportation, infrastructure, and public works services to be administered by the proposed Metro City. The leadership of the Missouri chapter of APWA and the St. Louis branch to the Missouri chapter, about 20 people, met right before the February APWA monthly luncheon to discuss the merger proposal. We had about an hour-long discussion, and then from that meeting, a 7-member subcommittee formed. That subcommittee is comprised of myself, so chapter president and vice president, Mike Bush, the branch chair, Steve Meyer, and the vice chair, Chris Linneman. He's not here today. Our chapter delegate, Eric Landwehr, who is from Cole County and Jefferson City area. The chapter director of communications, John Collins, and branch member, Jason Dorman. So we have 3 folks that are from public agencies within St. Louis County, 1 from a public agency out in Jefferson City area, and then 3 are from engineering consulting firms here in St. Louis. So what this subcommittee has done thus far, we have reviewed the Better Together documents and related articles. We have arranged for education on the merger proposal and the statewide vote, beginning here at the St. Louis branch level. And we're offering 2 perspectives. So today's perspective from Better Together, and then in July, Pat Kelly from the Municipal League will be here to speak. The subcommittee created, vetted, and distributed that survey that went out to the branch to obtain feedback about the proposal. The subcommittee thought it was best to begin with education and obtaining feedback here at the St. Louis level, and then determine if we're going to expand to our chapter, which, as you all know, serves the entire state of Missouri, with the exception of the KC metro area. Our subcommittee has reviewed the feedback. We're going to be sharing that feedback with the Missouri chapter executive board meeting, executive board at that meeting on Sunday down at Spring Conference. We have engaged our APWA national advocacy staff about this topic. Our group plans to work on education on this topic to the whole chapter. Let's see, we also solicited questions for today's speaker, and we met and reviewed those questions, had to edit some questions, and selected the questions for today, which are all going to be read by, bless you, by Steve Meyer. And for today's presentation, we did ask that Better Together, Mr. Johnson Malone, focus the presentation on, if possible, public works infrastructure, the analysis that was done by Better Together during their multi-year research period, how public works and infrastructure was addressed in the proposal that was published in January, how public works infrastructure services are envisioned to be delivered by Metro City during the transition period, and then permanently after the transition period should the amendment pass. So Mr. Johnson Malone will first give his presentation, then we're going to have the questions that Steve Meyer will be moderating using the questions that were submitted by those that registered for today's talk. So now I'm going to introduce Marius. Marius Johnson Malone serves as the Deputy Director of Community-Based Studies at Better Together. In this role, he develops and implements outreach efforts to directly engage and educate citizens in St. Louis City and County on key issues related to fragmentation, while supporting the research at Better Together's efforts. Before joining Better Together, Marius worked at Beyond Housing and on a variety of local, state, and federal campaigns. Here's Marius.
Thank you for that introduction, Ann. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. As Ann mentioned, my name is Marius Johnson Malone. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to come and speak with you this afternoon. I am going to give a brief overview of our recommendations and the process that led to those, and then as we'll open it to questions and hopefully get to some of those questions that you mentioned as a part of this and how public works and infrastructure was thought about. So just to give a brief overview, Better Together has been in existence since late 2013. We were formed really out of the interest of some civic leaders, namely Burt Walker, Ambassador Burt Walker, and some others who were interested in trying to address the divide between St. Louis City and St. Louis County. They recognized there was a level of fragmentation in this region and wanted to see those entities come together from an economic perspective. And one of the things that they quickly learned was that there was very little to no information compiled anywhere to inform that conversation for how we might move forward as a region. And so they formed our organization to do research speaking directly to that. And we started off doing 4 years of what we call community-based studies that really tried to look at collecting data from the governments, the local governments in this region, to understand what we have, and also collecting data from individuals who are interacting with these local governments on a daily basis. So we started our studies in 6 different areas. We looked at public finance, economic development, public safety, which included police, fire, and municipal courts. We then moved to parks and recreation and general administration. And I believe maybe I skipped over public health, excuse me. And in each of those areas, we just tried to answer basic questions. First, what is the status quo of delivery in the service areas? So how do we do things today? What are considered to be best practices in understanding how these areas could function? Best practices found both locally and from a national perspective. How do we as a region stack up to those best practices? So not so much understanding what does Hazelwood do versus Ellisville versus Wildwood, but what do we as St. Louis do in those comparison to those best practices? And then finally, what are some ways, if we're going to do things differently, to really move forward in a different direction in each of those different areas? So we set out and we did 4 years of research in those areas. We compiled data, we engaged the community in many different formats. In rooms like this, we had 34 different town halls. We had listening sessions and over 500 stakeholder meetings, and had a lot of different ways to try and get people to understand what we have, and so that we had an understanding of what we had. Let me also pause very briefly and define what the governments we were looking at is, because we were looking at municipal level services in the region as a start for our work. And so we were looking at the city of St. Louis, we were looking at St. Louis County, because about a third of the county's population lives in unincorporated St. Louis County. And then we looked at the 88 municipalities in St. Louis County. At that point it was 90, now we're at 88, and the 23 fire protection districts in St. Louis County as well. So those are the governments we were looking at. And what we found was that the St. Louis region is fragmented. I think and I'll go through each of these. We have an inefficient structure that is spending more money on fewer people, and has inequitable outcomes, and from a structural standpoint has a real inability to develop or implement any sort of bold vision for this region. So this region is fragmented. We have 684 elected officials in St. Louis City and St. Louis County, 88 municipalities, as I mentioned. We have a separate city and county, which is a pretty rare situation in the country. The only other major metropolitan area like that is Baltimore and Baltimore County. We have 55 different police departments with different standards for hiring and training and all of those things. And accompanying these governments is over 52,000 pages of ordinances. We're inefficient. The first thing we sought to do with our work is understand what we were spending in the region on these local governments. When we started our work, we were spending $2.3 billion every year on these regional governments. And what we found when we looked at other regions, because often we were asked, that sounds like a lot of money, how does it compare to other regions? When we looked at peers that had gone through their own forms of consolidation, like Indianapolis, like Louisville, we found that on a per capita basis, we were spending more than $750 million every year compared to our peers on similar services. We're spending more money. So when we started, I mentioned we spent $2.3 billion. In 3 years, that spending grew to $2.5 billion every year. We saw spending increase by $120 million in just that time period. Since April 2012, we've had 149 local tax increases approved from these local governments. That's not including school bonds or any of the governments that exist outside of those municipal functions, but 149 local tax increases. So what we know about that is that this trend is unsustainable. Despite all of this, we have fewer people that we're serving with these governments. St. Louis City has been losing population for several decades now, but in the 2010 census, we also saw St. Louis County for the first time in its history begin losing population. Most recent census estimates show that those trends have continued in both St. Louis City and in St. Louis County. And obviously next year we'll have an official census, but we are certainly not growing in the way that other areas are. And even when you expand that out beyond St. Louis City and St. Louis County, our metropolitan area is growing at a slower pace than other regions in this country. Despite all of the spending and all these resources within the structure, we still continue to deliver inequitable services. And this both on the input and on the outcomes side. We know that in certain areas you can get whatever services you might want from your local government, professional policing, great public works, great municipal courts, free tree trimming, different things like that. In other areas, we struggle to provide even the most basic services to some of our residents. And oftentimes they are the most vulnerable residents in our region. So they don't have adequate policing services because they're getting police officers that are making $13 an hour that have been fired from or allowed to resign from 2 other departments. And we also recognize that as we travel and work across different parts of this region, we all need to be able to rely on those basic levels of service being professional and at an adequate level. On the other side of that, we have outcomes that are a part of this structure where we have 18-year life expectancy gaps between the black and white residents in St. Louis, mere zip codes apart. This is a really unacceptable outcome when we think about all that we have going on in this region and what we would like to have in this place that we call home. We have also an inability to have, from a structural standpoint, we don't have any way to say, this is who we want to be as St. Louis. When people come from outside this region and they want to get something done, they're often asked, who speaks for St. Louis? And we don't have a clear voice on that. The mayor doesn't answer to the county executive doesn't answer to the mayor. None of the municipal mayors necessarily is responsible to each other or to the county executive. And so we struggle to have that clear, unified voice on who we want to be. That shows itself in both addressing our problems in this region, whether it be around trying to understand how do we get a handle on the issues of crime in this region and do something about that in a concerted way, but also in seeking opportunity. We're often rendered reactive versus being proactive to opportunities on the economic front. So when we reached the end of our initial studies, we sought to engage in a process that would produce outcomes that were a little bit different than what these types of studies typically do. We know that St. Louis has a long history of understanding and studying the problems that we have in this region and then those studies ending up on a shelf somewhere with little to no action that follows. And we wanted this time to be different, so we formed a task force of citizens to help give us a little bit of an outsider perspective so that we could know what might make sense for restructuring this region and reorganizing how we function. That task force looked at best practices coming out of other regions that had walked this path before, both in the things that they did well, but also understanding what they didn't do so great and how we might avoid some of their mistakes. So we looked to see what lessons they were learned, and some of the things we heard from places like Nashville, Indianapolis, and Louisville, who went through their own consolidations, is that they all had a clear, strong executive. My colleague, when he visited Indianapolis and Nashville recently, said that it was sort of like they each had their own retreats a week before we went to visit them, and they were all singing from the same hymnal. We certainly don't have that kind of unified voice in St. Louis, because we all have our own separate interests across this region. They had well-functioning legislative bodies that tended to be a little larger with professional staff to accompany those legislators. And they were structured in a way that they could continue to make improvements in their region. So each of them had their own consolidations that looked different than the one that is being discussed locally. But one of the things that was common among them was that they viewed their initial consolidation as a starting point for continued improvement for their local governments in their regions. From the task force process, they also looked to understand what are the values of the folks that live in this community, what are the things that they wanted to see in any government that existed here locally, what are the things they like about what they have, what are the things that they wanted to see different and done on a more regional basis. And from the process of looking at best practices, understanding the community feedback, understanding what there was in the way of reform efforts called for by other groups like the Ferguson Commission, like For the Sake of All, like the report on segregation in St. Louis, and housing in particular in St. Louis, 4 key principles emerged. Number one, folks said that they wanted to have a more unified voice for economic development. They were tired of the internal competition among the governments. They were tired of us spending so much of our time really fighting for economic development in the form of a big box store or retail in one community moving down the street to another community. And they said that we wanted to be able to focus on growing the economic pie in this region rather than moving it around. They said that they wanted to have high quality and consistent public safety in the region, particularly when it came to policing and municipal courts. There was a strong recognition that some of the things that we've all discovered and read about in the news over the last several years happening in the municipal courts with the overcollection of revenue to fund municipal governments was something that needed to end in this region because it was having a detrimental effect on citizens' lives. And again, oftentimes our most vulnerable citizens in this area. And they also recognize, as I mentioned before, that the way we do policing, with 55 different departments with their own standards for how they operate, was not sustainable if we wanted to be able to really address crime from a regional perspective. Folks said that they wanted to have an improved cost and efficiency of their local government services. So if we had this overspend in tax dollars, what does it look like to do something different with those dollars or potentially have savings from a citizen standpoint? And finally, they wanted to see the maintenance of their local identities in some of these communities. Wherever we went in this region, folks really said that they felt that one of the strengths of St. Louis was that we had these communities and that there was something about their locality that they really appreciated. They may not love their municipal court, but they certainly loved their 4th of July parade. They really appreciated their farmers markets and the things that made the cultural identities of their communities feel unique in this landscape. So out of that emerged these recommendations to create a new form of government in St. Louis City that would combine the city and the county into what we're calling a metro city. They would have one consolidated, well-resourced professional police department, one consolidated court system, municipal court system, a unified voice on economic development, and all of that, getting to that requires a constitutional amendment that if things go according to plan, would be on the ballot in November of 2020. This new government would be governed by an elected metro mayor and an elected 33-member metro council. And then in addition, there would be an elected assessor and prosecutor for the region. The metro city would provide policing, municipal courts, and economic development functions, including zoning and planning. The metro city would be funded through a mix of currently existing taxes, so property taxes, sales tax, utility taxes, all the things that we know, but they would be distributed and they would be the things funding the new government. Municipalities would continue to exist as municipal districts under this new form. So all the municipalities that exist today, again, based on things we heard from folks in the community as we went through this task force process, was that they wanted to see those things maintained. And so they would not have the ability to have their own police department, their own courts, but there would be functions for fire protection if they have that service. They would have parks and recreation services if that is something they wanted to continue, and general administration. And they would have a first pass in planning, so they would serve as a planning or board of adjustment commission to the metro city for plan those functions. They would be able to fund those operations through existing property taxes, through, utility taxes, fees for service that are currently collected, and then in some instances that we can get into, if it is one of the questions, there would be some sales tax that would continue to go back to the municipalities in specific instances. The city of St. Louis would be combining with the metro city, and in its place would be created a municipal corporation that was left behind to carry on any of the financial obligations that exist within the city of St. Louis, and actually within any other municipality. So one of the things that we heard as well through the course of our process, even before the task force, was that any look at this topic really needed to be sure that it wasn't a bailout of, in particular, the city of St. Louis, but really of any entity. And so all of these municipal districts and the St. Louis Municipal Corporation would be taxing sub-districts of the metro city, and that allows those obligations to be paid for by the citizens who incurred them in those jurisdictions. St. Louis City fire department would become a fire protection district. All other fire protection districts would remain as they are, and all other political subdivisions would stay as they are as well. The impact of this proposal is immediately St. Louis would become a top 10 city from a population standpoint. It would be about 1.3 million folks. Crime statistics would drop from being in those most dangerous categories, or the highest murder rate and all these things, to being in the top 30 or in the 30s as far as the ranking on those statistics. More importantly, our ability to address crime would be improved because we would have a unified way to share data. It would no longer be the situation where it is a single department's job to keep crime out of their region, but there's no one's job who's looking at this from a regional perspective to say, how do we address crime in the region? Because we know crime moves. We know that it's not isolated to any one part of the region. We'd have a more professional legislative staff to help the council versus what we have right now in like the city of St. Louis. We have aldermen who are sharing, 3 or 4 aldermen sharing one staffer. There's one attorney for the board of aldermen. And one of the things we learned was that we need to have those staff have legislative researchers and folks to be able to help them with constituent services to deliver a high quality of service to their residents. We've got streamlined business and permitting and licensing done at the regional level. And again, a single economic agenda for the region so that we can really invest in the areas that we need to grow our economy. So that is the broad strokes overview. I know that's exactly what it is, broad strokes overview. I encourage you to visit our website, bettertogetherstl.com, to get more into the details of some of the pieces of this, but I know we have several questions and I'm excited to answer them to the best of my ability.